Please be mindful that the subscribe and like buttons are ready to be smashed, so give them a click, or else I'll be very sad. SW7016, we got the code, now let's get to cracking. You want some information on Sherwin-Williams Mindful Gray? Well, what a coinky dink. I'm here to tell you about this color's overall makeup, but also how and where to use it, and what colors to use alongside it. So that's corresponding colors, but also trim colors too, very important. The SW701 blank color chip has some pretty prolific colors alongside it. On the lighter side, we have Repose Gray, and on the darker side, there's Dorian Gray, Dovetail, and Gauntlet Gray, all of which are rich with varying levels of depth and really sit in that beautiful taupe area of gray. There's really a sense of storminess present in all of these colors, especially as they get darker. But Mindful Gray, on the other hand, sits right in the middle of all of this with an LRV of 48. If you're not familiar, LRV stands for Light Reflectance Value, and it's simply just a scale that goes from 0 to 100. The higher you go, the lighter the color will appear, because it's reflecting more light. A color that's right in the middle of that spectrum has a decent amount of versatility because it's dark enough that you'll always notice it, but it's not going to take the place of an off-white color like Alabaster, which is going to appear way lighter. You can simply lump this color in the neutral grayish color category, and I get why, because it shares a lot of similarities to those other gray beige colors. It's gray, but doesn't feel all that cool, even though it does have a very subtle blue-green undertone that can sometimes pop up, but really, the color tends to feel closer to taupe rather than a steel cool gray, which for me makes it immensely easy to work with. When I take a look at this color, like right here for example, I don't think to myself, wow, that's a lot of beige. I think it's balanced pretty well. What sort of colors do I like to pair with Mindful Gray? Well, surprise, surprise, it's another gray, but this one is French. Ooh. Depending on where you're from, you may pronounce this color as gris or gris. But for this video, I'm just gonna say gris. All right, cool. This is obviously a cooler gray with a lot of blue in its undertones and a touch of green, and it gives it a slightly stainless steel type of feel. Because they're being so purposeful with the cool tone here, Mindful Gray ends up feeling even more welcoming in comparison, being the lighter and warmer of the two colors. That's sort of the trick here. Gris has a 39 LRV, and that doesn't make it overly dark, but it's certainly more deep in general. In a palette, I would likely want to see Mindful Gray used more, and then gris could be the secondary color in the palette, but to be fair, both are somewhat neutral and honestly a bit safe. The other color I want to bring up is a whole lot lighter, but arguably the bolder choice. With an LRV of 78, the other color you could incorporate is White Mint. And that is exactly what it is. A really pale, fresh tea green that introduces a lovely lightness to the palette, but also a fresh pop of color to cut through the more desaturated grays that we talked about earlier. What are my favorite trim colors to use alongside Mindful Gray? If you wanted a subtle trim that was more understated, you could have a chat with Mindful Gray's neighbor, Eider White. Google says Eider, so that's what I'm going with here. This is the color that isn't necessarily as light as I would traditionally see on trim because it has a 73 LRV, and that puts it in borderline off-white territory. But there's still about a 20% difference between that and Mindful Gray, so there's enough to notice the difference. If that's just a bit too close for comfort, another option would be to go with Snowbound, which has an 83 LRV and therefore has less visually apparent undertones because of its lightness. It's going to look more white and less of a light beige like Eider White. The nice thing is it's not going to be as bright as High Reflective White, so there still is some level of control and subtlety happening. But if you want to go really, really bright, there's always High Reflective White. The Chantilly lace of Sherwin-Williams. In general, I still think it's nice to have just a touch of warmth on your trim when you're using Mindful Gray in the main areas of your home, but that's personal preference. In general, I like a touch of warmth on my trim when I'm using Mindful Gray on the walls, but that's me. The big question is, where would I use Mindful Gray in a home? And the answer is, wherever I can. Even though it's darker, this is a color that you could label as main color caliber. Its undertones don't really conflict with any specific color types, And yes, it's a bit darker than Repose Gray, for example, but that could sometimes work to your advantage. By going with a deeper color, you are more likely to see the color despite your lighting, rather than taking the safer approach and picking a light color, which just becomes too light and uninteresting. If you want a color that's just a bit lighter, then check out our Repose Gray video right over here. Conveniently, it's Mindful Gray's lighter neighbor, and it's pretty sweet. Just like me. Right, guys? That was a bit too long of a stare, but anyway.